So, hello everyone. My name is Andraus. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi online gathering as we focus on how Israel meddles in and prevents Palestinian families. We are joined today by Tariq Al-Zughbi. Before we start, I would like to remind you that this session is being broadcast live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared in chat so that others may join. I'd now like to let Tariq introduce himself and begin his presentation. We will let him speak for as long as he wants, then I will ask him your questions from the chat. Please take it away, Tariq.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Sabil and to the organizers, to the moderators for this important work and for having me as a speaker today. So my name is Tariq Al-Zughbi. I'm a Palestinian Christian from the small village of Bethlehem. And I think today's topic is a little bit about family unification. Maybe to start, I would share a little bit about my own family's personal experience with this. So as I said, I'm from Bethlehem, Palestine, but my mother is American and my father is Palestinian. My father, Zughbi, is the founder of WIAM Center, and he and my mother met in Jerusalem in the 80s, and then they got married in the 90s, in 1990, before the Oslo Accords. And they've been married since 1990, living off of tourist visas for my mother since that year, so almost 33 years. And for this visa renewal process, it entails my mother entering the country, receiving a visa for 3 months, and then sending in applications for visa extensions in hopes that she will receive visa extensions, and then being able to stay until the visa runs out, and then she has to leave for a period of 6 weeks at least, now up to half a year before she's able to come back. So in the early 1990s, when they first got married, they applied for family unification. They have since applied for 29 times and have yet to hear a positive response. But they were part of various legal cases within Israel advocating for Palestinians married to international or non-Palestinian citizen holding spouses. And they were able to receive a decree from the Israeli court in the early 1990s that they have the right to live in Palestine or with their spouse for up to 27 months before they would be forced for the spouse to leave the country and start the process all over again. And so up until 2018, my father and mother lived this way. My mother being able to apply for this visa, receiving extensions. Until November, she applied for her first extension after coming in for 3 months, which was denied, and then she left 6 days later. In 2019, my brother Lucas was getting married, the first wedding within our nuclear family. And so my mother was coming in April to help prepare the family for the May wedding. On April 2nd, she left the US, and then she arrived in Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport at April 3rd, where she was held for 12 hours of detention before she was forced onto another plane back to the US and formally denied entry. So in 2019, she was given 2 main reasons at the beginning stages of this denial. The first was for considerations of public security and safety, considering my mother a disruption to public order within Israel. The second accusation was for the purposes of preventing illegal immigration. And from the paper that we received, the formal denial from the Israeli occupation, it stated for purposes of stopping illegal settlement within the West Bank. Here, of course, referring to Palestinian spouses, not to Jewish Israeli settlers within the many settlements of the West Bank. So April 3rd, she was sent back on a plane, arriving in the US April 4th, 60 hours to return to the same place that she had left. So then we began a frantic process to be able to bring her in for the wedding, which resulted in sending applications to Kogat, which is the Israeli military personnel responsible for Judea and Samaria, which is what is used to refer to the West Bank and Palestinian territories. And then she was able to receive permission to enter on May 20th, almost 6 days before the wedding, as long as we were willing to pay a 70,000 shekel guarantee that she would follow the Israeli laws and procedures, which means that as soon as she enters, she's given the specific time frame that she's allowed to stay, which is 3 months at a time. And she's only allowed to go to areas A and B of the West Bank only, which means when she first married my father, she had the same rights as any international visitor coming to Israel. She could drive an Israeli license-plated car. She could enter Jerusalem. She could traverse the checkpoints and barriers. To now, she became in the same status as a Palestinian citizen from the West Bank, only able to continuously or constantly remain and stay in areas A and B of the West Bank. And without the right to apply for a permit to enter Israel until this situation is resolved. And so for the past 4 or 5 years, she has been in the situation where before coming, she has to apply to Kogat, to the Israeli military authorities. Then she has to wait around 6 to 8 weeks to hear from them. And then they give her a 3-day window to travel from the United States to Amman, Jordan, because she's no longer allowed to enter through Tel Aviv, where she then has to cross the same border that most Palestinians use, the King Hussein border, also known as the Alembi Bridge. And then she has to go through the Israeli security there, through security checkups, and then she's allowed admittance into Area A and B of the West Bank. It's funny to say that as COVID was hitting the whole world and disrupting business as usual, during this time, my mother was able to extend her visa simply because of COVID. And so she was able to stay longer than this 3-month period. But she ended up leaving in January as her last extension ended. And then she came to Malta. I recently got engaged around 3 weeks ago. And so she and my mother and sister, my father and sister were able to come to Malta for the engagement. And then the plan was that she would come from the States to Malta, have the engagement, and then go back home with my father to their house in Bethlehem. Well, while she was in Malta, we contacted the Israeli authorities as we had not yet heard from them as it related to her right to enter or for her permission to enter Area A and B. And they informed us that she had to restart her application. At the beginning, they said that she had made a mistake in the application. After further investigation, it had just turned out that they had never opened up her application. And so then they said that, I'm sorry, we have to restart the process. And so instead of going from Malta back to the West Bank, back to Bethlehem, she was forced to get on a plane and leave Malta back to the US, and is currently waiting for them to grant her permission to enter again, and hopes to be able to come back in mid-September, if all goes well. So this is just one simple story of many. In my own family, there are at least 5 individuals who are already in this situation, although the situations differ from one person to another. I have my brother who's married to a Palestinian woman who grew up in California. And as part of her family's heritage or oral history, her family left on her mother's side during the Ottoman period and settled in Honduras, and then made their way to California, while the father grew up in the West Bank until the 70s and then immigrated to the US. So she was born and lives without a Palestinian citizenship. Before she got married to my brother, she had free access to the country, being able to go through Tel Aviv airport, to go through Israel and Palestine as she wishes. And then in their most recent visit after the wedding, she was told that she's in the same situation as my mother, and that she effectively, even though she's Palestinian, has to apply to the Israeli authorities through COGAT to receive permission to enter Area A and B only, and that she can only receive this permission for a limited amount of time. The last time she came, she received it for around 60 days, not even the full 3 months. Thirdly, I have 2 or 3 cousins who are married to, one to an American, one to a Dutch woman, and one to a Swedish woman, and they're all in the same boat. And now finally, I add myself to this future list. I am currently engaged to a woman who has an Afro-Latina heritage, but grew up in Germany and therefore has the German passport. And as soon as we're married, we're expecting that she will face the similar problems. And in fact, when it comes to Israel's policies, in 2020, there were a few changes in the law that then solidified in 2022. And so one of these laws relates to people from the West or international visitors, not just the West, who are in romantic relationships with Palestinians. And so a law that was passed in July that became effective in September 2022 stipulates that if you are romantically engaged or have a love interest with a Palestinian of the West Bank, that upon entry to Israel's Tel Aviv airport, you must declare this love interest to the Israeli authorities. And then within this, that for future visits, you would be forced to again go through COGAT, which is the military administration of Judea and Samaria, or of the West Bank. And so we see throughout Israel's life so far, there has been this policy in which Palestinian populations have been securitized. And so if you study international relations, of course, you know that when an entity is securitized, then the state has the right to use any means necessary to target or to combat or to mitigate that security threat. And so we see this internally, because even though we are focused now on Palestinians and expatriates and the relationships between them, we also see this within Palestinian divisions. When we talk about the average Palestinian, there are 4 or 5 types of legal status which they fall under. The first is you have the Palestinian from the West Bank, the Palestinian from the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians from Jerusalem who are Jerusalem residents and don't fall under any form of citizenship. Under the Israeli law, they're treated as migrants to Israel, and many of them have a Jordanian passport. But the first page of that Jordanian passport will say that this is not a citizenship. So the Israelis treat them like migrants and as Jordanian citizens, where the Jordanians treat them like temporary residents because they are considered Palestinian. And so they don't have the right to vote in national elections. And they also fall into 2 categories, those of temporary Jerusalem residency and those of permanent Jerusalem residency. And then you get to the stage with maybe the greatest rights as it relates to being able to live in Palestine, Israel, and those are Palestinian citizens of Israel. So those Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. But as you see, if you want to have a relationship between these different groups, there can be a loss of privilege or a loss of power. You can always apply for these groups to receive greater privilege, but it's very difficult to come by. At the moment, for the Jerusalem residents, for instance, around 34% of all those who apply for Israeli citizenship are only approved in the preliminary early stages. And so you see it's the vast majority that are not included. And so I can also share, I have an uncle who is married to a woman from Jerusalem. They have 6 children. They were married prior to the Oslo Accords. 2 of their children were born after the Oslo Accords, 4 were born before. And so the woman, my aunt, she has Jerusalem permanent residency. Her husband, my uncle, has Palestinian West Bank ID, which means they do not have the right to live within the same geographical territory together. Because for Jerusalem residents, one of the means of maintaining that is stipulated in Israeli law that Jerusalem must be the center of their livelihood. And so they must continually hold a permanent or semi-permanent presence within Jerusalem, which for my Palestinian uncle is a territory that he only has legal access to when the Israeli authorities grant him military permission to be and enter that territory. Of their 6 children, the first 4 children who were born prior to the Oslo Accords are in the same boat as me and have Palestinian West Bank ID, also known as the Green ID, and can only have permanent residence in the areas of the West Bank, of Area A and B, unless they are granted special permissions by the military authorities. The other 2 children recently changed from having temporary residency, which means that they had to continuously prove that Jerusalem was the center of their livelihood, to now moving towards permanent residency. And therefore, you see within this small family, all Palestinian with different forms of status and legal recognition, they also have this fragmented life. And so when it comes to the Palestinian population at large, there's an estimated 30,000 Palestinians who are in the same position as my parents, those who have some spouse who does not have any form of Palestinian ID or citizenship, and who they're hoping they can receive family unification or some legal status for that spouse. This number 30,000, though, does not include the total number. This is simply the number of applications that have been received for family unification. And so the greater number is estimated somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, as many Palestinians, especially in light of the continuing occupation of the worsening conditions and Israeli policies as it relates to these groups of people, they decide maybe it's better or easier to give up, to immigrate to Europe, to the States, maybe to the country of the other spouse, and create a life there. And this is, of course, something that Israel is also aware of. In 1989, when Israel was taking, of course, prior to the Palestinian Authority's establishment, when Israel was formally, directly, and physically occupying all of the West Bank, they took a decree as it related to expatriates marrying Palestinian nationals, saying that only the state of Israel, the highest authority in this land, has the right to determine, not individual wants, needs, desires. And within this said, just because we have taken this law doesn't mean that these couples are doomed to fail. They also have the right to go and live together elsewhere and abroad. And so this was in '89. And so when we talk about today, getting married is only one hurdle as it relates to Palestinian families' ability to live together, whether it's Palestinians with other Palestinians within Palestine, whether it be the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, or Israel, or whether it be Palestinian families that are connected to other countries or other nationalities. All of them fall under the Israeli legal system. And as Israel maintains control over the entirety of the borders, especially of the West Bank, Israel alone has the right to produce or to grant visas, whether they are coming to Israel and Palestine or whether they are simply planning on staying in Palestine. Israel is the only granting authority for these visas and permissions. And so maybe before ending, I will say one more thing. And many of you, I think, have been to Palestine, to the Palestinian territories. As I'm speaking, I'm seeing quite a few names that I am familiar with, but many of you will know that for many Palestinians, the most direct way to resist Israeli occupation or the policies of Israel is through continuing the existence of Palestinian communities. And therefore, anything that we do to strengthen Palestinian resistance, to strengthen Palestinian community, is part of our active, direct, nonviolent resistance against Israeli colonial settler occupation. And so within this, even though the situation may be stark, and I think through every Kumi week, there's a new focus of a situation in which Palestinians or others are oppressed and marginalized within this conflict. There's also many organizations that are dedicated to strengthening Palestinian community, to advocating for Palestinians, and to sending their voices, to sending their stories abroad in hopes that especially our international brothers and sisters may be able to put pressure on their own countries, on their own governments, to be a voice for peace building in Palestine, Israel, instead of to be a voice that is complicit or that is continuing the occupation. And so Palestine, we are very blessed to have many of these organizations, from Sabil to WeAm to many others that are working within the community to try and strengthen Palestinian community. And so I will just end there and give it back to Sabil.
Yes, thank you very much, Tariq, for all this information. So there is a question for you. The first one is, where it went? So 1 second. Yes, isn't A part of a Bethlehem area and area C? So your mother cannot go into Israel or area C. So maybe it's if you can explain area A and C, it seems that we don't know.
Yes, so the best way, I would highly recommend that you use online resources that are available to look at these areas. But Bethlehem is divided, especially when we talk about Bethlehem governance. It falls into area A, B, and C. Around 87% of Bethlehem governance is part of area C and is no longer as accessible in the same way as areas A and B. And so for those maybe who have been to Bethlehem, if you know the Nativity Church, the city center, that falls under area A and B. If you've been to WeAm, WeAm starts off in one part of Bethlehem, area C. And so as it relates to my mother, for instance, she has the right to go to the Church of Nativity, but doesn't have the right to go to our center, to WeAm Center in Bethlehem, because that's part of area C. And when we talk about the whole of the West Bank, around 62% of the West Bank falls under area C, and the remaining part falls under area A and B. And it's not the only distinction that exists geographically within the West Bank area. If you go to Hebron, you also get into H1 and H2, further divisions.
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so there's another question. Hello, Tariq, have you a dual passport?
Yes. Because my mother is American and I was born in the States, I am both an American and Palestinian citizen. And we are currently in a time of change as it relates to my abilities potentially within Palestine, Israel, because of a reciprocity agreement between the Biden administration and Israel that enables Israelis to enter the US without having to apply for a visa beforehand. And in exchange for that, Palestinians or any American, regardless of background or nationality, would have the right to enter Israel. But it's important to note that within this agreement, it is stipulated that Israel still has the right to deny these rights to any American who may have security concerns related to the state of Israel, which would also then include my mother. But for me, before this reciprocity agreement, I'm 29 years old, for 28 years out of my life so far, up until this July, potentially, I have only been recognized as a Palestinian citizen in Palestine. In the early 2000s, when we were being bombed, one of my siblings had medical needs due to falling downstairs, and we were under curfew. And so we tried calling some Israeli doctors who said they could not intervene because the Israelis were invading Bethlehem and putting Bethlehem under their control. It was part of the 40-day siege. And then my mother called the US Embassy, and the US Embassy said that they could send Israeli personnel to extract her, but that her 4 children who are dual citizens would have to remain home, because even though the USA at that time hadn't recognized the state of Palestine at all, and its recognition is still complicated and a matter of technicality, that Palestine was fully recognized in terms of its obligations to its citizens. And for those purposes, we were fully Palestinian citizens. Our American citizenship was not recognized, and the state of Palestine was fully responsible for us. And so within this, most Americans have the right to go into Palestine, Israel, to traverse borders, to drive Israeli license-plated cars. Up until this July, and I keep saying up until potentially, because we're not sure yet how the implementation will happen fully. But until this July, I was in the same situation as Palestinians in the West Bank when it came to living in Palestine. I had no other or additional rights. Outside of Palestine, I had the rights of an American and could travel most places visa-free.
Another question, this must cost a fortune in flights and travel, referring to what happened with your mom and going back. What are the other costs associated with all of these applications and dealing with Israeli nonsense?
Yeah, so of course, there's the financial costs, which can be measured every time we send in an application. We also have to send in a payment. I believe it's close to 600 to 1,000 shekels, depending on how the laws change in Israel and the fees associated with this application. There's also, of course, the cost of applying for family unification, which is additional to just having the right to be in a place. It's a separate application process. You also have the additional costs of lawyers, should you choose to fight within courts. There are various organizations, both Israeli and Palestinian, that are fighting for Palestinian expatriate spouses' rights to live together in Israeli courts. But the greater costs, I would say, are the social and psychological costs. The cost on the psyche, or the burden on the psyche of not knowing where you are going to be and for how long and until when. My mother does not have a home that she owns in the US. Every time she is kicked out of the country and forced to leave, she must rely on the kindness and generosity of her family. So at the moment, she is living with my grandmother, her own mother, in Michigan. And of course, it's always nice to live with family, but it's not the same comfort of being able to live within your own home. And of course, I didn't say this before, but my mother helped my father build this house that we live in. It was not constructed before she came. They constructed it together, and then we moved in together as a family. There's also the financial cost that I forgot of, the 70,000 shekel guarantee, which, to contextualize it, the average salary in the Palestinian territories is around 2,000 shekels a month. So we're talking about 35 months at the average salary for a cost of guarantee. We recently asked the authorities when we can hope to receive that money back. And the very swift reply was when she no longer wishes to visit. And so, of course, this is a cost that we'll likely incur for as long as my mother chooses to live in her own home or in her own house. There's also The ticket costs, of course, because when you are given permission to enter and you only have 3 days to travel, the cost of buying the ticket a week or 2 days or 3 days or even the same day of travel is usually much greater than when you're able to budget time and look for the tickets and track the ticket prices and buy months in advance. And then the same as when it comes for her time to leave, we apply for visa extensions towards the last month of her visa, but then we oftentimes receive the reply 2 days, 3 days before her visa ends. And if the reply is negative, then she's forced to leave the country again, and we're forced to buy a departure ticket unless she wants to stay in Jordan for a longer time, straight to the US, and then that's also an additional cost. And I think the additional cost of where do I meet my family? My father only holds a Palestinian passport. And so if he wants to come to the States for a family reunion, then we have to apply for an American visa. If we want to have a family reunion in Palestine, then we have to consider whether we want my mother, my brother's wife, and in the future, my wife to be part of that reunion, or whether we're okay with that reunion taking place without them. And so the psychological burden of being unable to legally live together in the same place, especially in one's home as a family, is far greater than the financial burden, even though the financial burden is quite great.
It's another question. How did the Oslo Accords affect the status of Palestinians living in Jerusalem, in the West Bank? What was the status before the Oslo Accords?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's a bit of a complicated question because it depends on the Palestinian and where they were. So for the most part, in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, we were under Jordanian and Egyptian administration until '67. Then after the Six-Day War, Israel directly annexed parts of these areas and then occupied the rest up until 1993. So for the most part, any Palestinian that wasn't recognized as an Israeli citizen prior to 1993, 1994, 1995, they would be eligible for a Jordanian passport. And so they did not have formal citizenship unless they had a Jordanian citizenship, which is different than having simply a Jordanian travel document, which is what most of these Palestinians had. And specifically for Jerusalem, this remained the status until today for the most part. Not everyone in Jerusalem has a Jordanian travel document, but many Palestinians, if they wanted to, would be able to receive one, especially from the Jerusalem residents. But one of the problems that occurred in the early 1990s is there was a group of close to 14,000 Palestinians who left being told that they had to renew their Jordanian passport in Jordan, and they left the borders, and upon leaving, Israel ripped up their identities and they were no longer able to return back. And so this is still an ongoing case in Israeli courts for this number in the thousands of Palestinians who had any status that they had within the territories completely denied and became unrecognized, and then the Jordanian status was forced upon them. But so today you have those in the West Bank with Palestinian citizenship, and then you have those in Jerusalem, largely with Jerusalem residency status, and are therefore treated as migrants before the law. So in terms of Jerusalem, the status hasn't changed much before or after Oslo.
I have a question. Is there like any cases in the West Bank where we were successful to get a visa that they can live in the West Bank with their spouses?
It's also a complicated question because in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been changes as it relates to the Palestinian Authority's ability to naturalize expatriates. And so when we talk about the Palestinian Authority, it's also first important to mention that even though it is responsible for the registry of Palestinian citizens, it does not have the right to grant citizenry or status without Israel's thumbs up or without Israel agreeing to this. And so in the past 2 years at least, but starting from 5 years ago, the Palestinian Authority has been able to negotiate with Israel, and they're able to give a limited number of naturalized citizens for these expatriates and for Palestinians who never received the identity because their parents were living abroad and they grew up internationally. And so in this year and last year, I believe the number is close to 5,000 of Palestinians who are either Palestinian by ancestry but have no legal ID, or those who are married to Palestinians and are internationals were able to receive citizenship. So, but it wasn't through winning a case in Israel. It was technically through successful negotiations by the PA, by the Palestinian Authority, with Israeli officials.
Okay. Another question: are people issued a Palestinian passport?
Yeah, so any Palestinian citizen, whether in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, has the right to a Palestinian passport, but that Palestinian passport is very limited in its power. In a recent issuing of the greatest and worst passports, the Palestinian passport landed at number 7. But as it relates to residents of Jerusalem, they are not entitled to a Palestinian passport without the risk of losing their Jerusalem residency. So they almost have to choose between the right to vote in Palestinian national politics or the right to traverse borders, because Jerusalem residents have the right to drive Israeli license-plated cars, and they have the right to cross most of the borders. I say most because as it relates to the Gaza Strip, it becomes a very difficult matter for any Palestinian or Israeli or international to grant permission to enter the Gaza Strip. And so you can get a Palestinian passport again as a Palestinian citizen, but for much of the world, it is difficult for you to gain any added access or right through that passport. And I can tell you from firsthand experience of taking Palestinian delegations on traveling with a Palestinian passport can be a nightmare. I was going through Germany about 2 years ago. I have an American Palestinian citizenship, so I have both passports, but I had 10 students who were all Palestinian. They took all 10 of them to a secure location within the airport and placed all of their passports under purple light because they didn't believe there was anything as a Palestinian passport. And we ended up staying there for close to 3 hours before they finally released them after I intervened and showed them all the documentation that I had from the inviting German partners, and showed them all the documentation that we had from the German embassy through one of the companies that works on helping Palestinians receive visas in Ramallah.
Someone is asking if you can please talk about the new visa waiver agreement.
Yes, with Israel and the US, I assume.
Yes, I think so.
So at the moment, the new agreement is that all Israelis wishing to enter the States would have the visa requirement waived, which means they would not have to apply prior to their travels to enter the States for a visa and wouldn't have to wait for approval. And in exchange for that, Palestinians or any Arab or any person who has an American citizenship would have the right to enter Israel as any tourist does, for a period of 3 months and renewable. But within this agreement, Israel has stipulated that any person with security concerns, which do not have to be defined, can be denied these rights and privileges, even if they do hold the American passport. But so what this change means is, especially for Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, those who have American passports, who have to rely on Israeli military permission to enter the Israeli-controlled territories in Israel, they would be able to, one, traverse the borders, drive Israeli license plates, stay in Israeli hotels or apartments if they chose to, and they would have the right to travel through Ben Gurion Airport. All of these rights which are denied to the Palestinian unless they receive this special military permission. And even with military permission, the rights are limited. So for instance, there are 15 different types of Israeli military permission that Palestinians can receive. Most of them have limits on how long they can be within Israel, including certain hours during the day, and most of them include a stipulation that they cannot stay overnight within Israel. So this would all be changed in this agreement, and these Palestinians who have this American passport would then be able to enter through Ben Gurion only after they've applied through COGAT if they have Palestinian citizenship, or through another military Israeli agency that has been set up for Americans of Arab nationality or ancestry who do not have Palestinian citizenship. And then once approved, they'd be able to enter and live in the land or in the area for up to 3 months with the possibility of extension. But again, there is that stipulation that for any security concerns, Israel has the right to deny these rights to this group of people. And so we are waiting to see how that will unfold.
Oh, wow. Crazy. Another question, could you give us an update on WIAM? What has WIAM been working on lately?
Yeah, thank you very much. So WIAM just finished its annual children's summer camp. We had 3 weeks of young children, I believe from the youngest close to 4 or 5 years old to 18 and 19, with much of the greater older generation between 14 and 19 acting as camp counselors and volunteers. And so that 3 weeks just ended and we had a celebration about a week ago. If you go to our website, you can see some glimpses, including some videos of that celebration. WIAM also continues to work on its various programmings, especially its women peace and security programming. And so we are active in various villages, mostly around Jericho, Bethlehem, and Hebron, including Beit Hanina in Jerusalem, or in Jerusalem governance, working on women empowerment as it relates to economic, political, and social empowerment. We've continued with our youth training and training of trainers to try and increase the multiplicity of our programs, training youth in gender sensitivity and conflict mediation and resolution, both in Western models, but in also the Palestinian Arab tradition of sulha. And of course, we continue to be engaged with our international visitors who are coming to learn about the land. They're coming to see how we're doing in organizing trips for various delegations, and of course, our conflict mediation within the Palestinian, community, sulha.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, would be available on the Kumi Now website and in YouTube in a day or so, and it will be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you see them. Would greatly appreciate it if you share the session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on our future webinars. I would like to thank our guest Tariq for being with us today. Thank you for your time and for your work. Is there any last thought you would like to leave us with?
I just want to thank everyone for being here and thank you for facilitating this conversation. Of course, for Sabeel for continuing its great work and the Kumi project. And I think just to thank all of those who are listening to us. I think all of us come from lives in which we are busy with our own struggles, with our own problems. And it's really hopeful to see you taking an hour and a half out of your days to hear oftentimes the depressing news and stories that we share. And that gives us a great deal of hope because we also know that you won't just listen to these and be depressed with us, that you'll take them and use that energy to further your activism and solidarity with us. And within this, Sabeel liberation theology, there is a way for all of us to live with liberation, living under justice and equity, and being able to enjoy life as it should be enjoyed. So thank you again to Sabeel, to Andraos, to Ryan, and to all of you here with us.
No, thank you very much for you, Tariq. It was a great pleasure to hear you. So next week, we will focus on collective punishment. Our guest next week will be Cindy and Greg Corey of the Rachel Corey Foundation. It has been 20 years since Rachel was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza back in 2003. Please join us next Tuesday to meet Greg and Cindy and share the links being shared in chat. If you'd like to be reminded of our online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. We are looking forward to see you all next week with Greg, Cindy and Greg. And thanks again and good night.